The moment my father walked into the kitchen holding my acceptance letter to Osgood Hall Law School, I knew the conversation that was coming had been rehearsed 100 times in his head before he ever opened his mouth. He set it down on the granite counter between us like evidence at a trial. He was a partner at one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in Toronto. He had been a partner for 22 years. His name was on the building's directory in gold lettering, right below the founding partners who had long since retired to their cottages in Muskoka. That letter wasn't just my future to him. It was the continuation of something he had decided before I was old enough to have an opinion about it. "All's good," he said, tapping the envelope. "Full admission. September intake." He looked at me the way he looked at contracts that had already been signed, like the matter was settled. I was 23 years old, sitting at that kitchen counter with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, and I had already been accepted. I'd applied because saying no felt impossible back then. But something had shifted in me over those months between application and acceptance. Something quiet and irreversible, the way ice cracks in March before the whole surface gives way. I told him I wasn't going. He didn't raise his voice. Not yet. That came later. What he did first was go very still, the way he did in depositions when someone said something he hadn't anticipated. He asked me to repeat myself. I did. I told him I wasn't going to law school. I told him I had been doing photography for the past 4 years. Not as a hobby, but seriously, technically, obsessively, the way he had once told me to approach anything worth doing. I had been shooting architecture and urban landscape, selling prints to galleries, building a client base for commercial licensing work. I had been quietly, carefully building something real. My mother was standing by the window. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Claire, what will people think?" That sentence, those 5 words, was the entire architecture of my childhood summarized in a single breath. My father stood up from his stool. He picked up the acceptance letter and held it for a moment before setting it back down very precisely. He told me that if I walked away from Osgood, I was walking away from everything he had built for me. He used the word investment. He said he had invested in me. He meant it as a statement of care. I understood even then that he believed it was care. But hearing your own life described as an investment does something to you that doesn't fully heal for a very long time. He told me I had 1 week to change my mind. I used that week to think, not about changing my mind, but about how to have the harder conversation I had been avoiding for months. When I came back to him at the end of that week and told him my decision was the same, that's when he raised his voice. That's when the kitchen, with its granite counters and sub-zero refrigerator and the framed family photos my mother had arranged so carefully on the wall, became the place where something broke. "Get out," he said. "If you're going to throw away everything I've given you, then get out. And don't come back until you come to your senses." My mother stood near the hallway. She had her arms crossed, not in anger, more like she was holding herself together. She didn't contradict him. She never contradicted him. She looked at me with something in her eyes that might have been sorrow, or might have been an apology she had already decided she would never say out loud. I picked up my camera bag from the hall closet. I had packed a bag the night before, not out of pessimism, but out of practicality. I had known him my entire life. I walked out of that house in Forest Hill on a Tuesday morning in late September. The maple trees on the street were just starting to turn. That particular shade of orange-red against a gray Toronto sky is something I will always associate with the feeling of a door closing behind me. Not a slamming door, just a quiet click, the kind that is somehow worse. I called my friend Jess from the sidewalk. She was a photographer I had met through a gallery showing 2 years earlier, someone who had built her own freelance business from nothing and had the kind of practical, unsentimental intelligence that I desperately needed in that moment. She told me to come over. She had a spare room in her apartment in Leslieville. I stayed there for 3 weeks while I figured out my next steps. The first few days were the strangest. I had grown up in a house in Forest Hill, gone to private school, spent summers at their family's cottage on Lake Joseph. Comfort had been the water I swam in for so long that I hadn't understood it as anything other than the normal state of things. Suddenly paying attention to groceries, calculating whether I could afford both a new lens filter and a TTC monthly pass, these were adjustments that felt both humbling and clarifying in a way I hadn't expected. I got a part-time job at a coffee shop on Queen Street East. The owner was a quiet Portuguese-Canadian man named Manuel, who made the best pastel de nata I had ever eaten and who asked me exactly once what I was doing there and then never brought it up again. I worked 3 mornings a week. enough to cover rent once I moved into a small bachelor apartment on Dundas East, which I found through a Kijiji listing and which had a north-facing window that cast the most extraordinary flat, diffused light across the entire space in the afternoons. I shot everything. I shot the apartment, the fire escape, the alley behind the building, the CN Tower visible between rooftops in the distance, the way winter light in Toronto hits brick differently than summer light, colder and more direct, less forgiving and somehow more honest. I had been building a body of work before I left my parents' house, but something unlocked after I left. There was no one watching anymore. There was no audience of one waiting to evaluate whether what I was doing was worthy of the Beaumont name, which was my father's name, the name that appeared in gold letters on a directory on Bay Street. I had started going by Claire Mercer. Mercer was my mother's maiden name. I hadn't announced it or made a formal change. I simply started signing my prints that way. And then one day, I realized I had been introducing myself as Claire Mercer for several months without having made a conscious decision to do so. I spent 2 winters shooting almost exclusively in the Canadian Shield, driving up to places like Killarney and Temagami and the eastern shore of Georgian Bay with Jess, and occasionally alone, shooting the exposed Precambrian rock and the black spruce and the lakes that went from steel blue to pewter to the color of old mirrors depending on the time of day and cloud cover. Something about that landscape, its age, its complete indifference to human drama, was exactly what I needed to be near. It had been there for 1 billion years before my father decided what my life should look like, and it would be there long after any of us finished arguing about it. Jess had connections to the commercial side of photography that I was still developing. She introduced me to an art director at a Toronto agency who was working on a campaign for a Muskoka tourism board. I shot 3 days in Huntsville and the surrounding area in late October, peak color season. The kind of images that make people in offices in February physically ache. The campaign ran the following spring. My name was in the credits. It was not a large credit. No one called my parents' house to congratulate them. The commercial work started to grow after that. I shot for a Vancouver architecture firm's new development in downtown Toronto, then for a national outdoor apparel brand based in Calgary, then for a feature in a real estate magazine covering heritage properties in Quebec City. I was not rich. I was consistently working, which in photography is a different and more important thing. There was a period, I think, in my second year after leaving Forest Hill, when I understood that I had made the right decision, but couldn't yet feel it. I knew it intellectually, the way you know that medicine tastes terrible but will help. The feeling took longer. It came gradually, in increments. The way the light changes in early March, when you suddenly realize one afternoon that it's staying later, and something in your body responds before your brain catches up. My brother called me once, about 8 months after I had left. My brother was 30. 3 years older than me, and he had gone to law school, joined our father's firm, and was by all external measures exactly what a Beaumont son was supposed to be. He called on a Thursday evening. He asked how I was doing in the careful, slightly formal way of someone who had been coached, or who was coaching himself. I told him I was fine. He said he hoped I would consider reaching out to her parents. I told him I didn't think the timing was right. He said he understood. He said Dad was proud of me, which was so profoundly untrue that I had to take a breath before responding. I said thank you, and I meant it as a conversation-ending courtesy, and we said goodbye, and I sat in my apartment for a long time afterward with the phone face down on the kitchen table. I didn't hear from any of them again for almost 1.5 years. In that time, I had been working on something I had not told anyone about, not even Jess. I had been shooting a series, not commercially, not for any client, but for myself, for the project itself. I had been photographing the same 47 locations across Ontario and Quebec in every season, returning to each site in winter, spring, summer, and autumn, tracking how these specific places, a dock in the Kawarthas, a grain elevator outside Guelphus, a particular stretch of the Niagara Escarpment, a housing block in Côte des Nègres, transformed across a full calendar year. I had been working on this series for 3 years. I had roughly 1,200 final images from which I had selected 214 for the complete series. I called it The Permanent Things. I did not expect what happened next. I had submitted a proposal to a gallery in Toronto's Distillery District, a mid-sized commercial gallery with good foot traffic and a reputation for taking risks on emerging work. They accepted the proposal for a 6-week show. I also sent a small portfolio of images from the series to a licensing inquiry I had received through my website from a publisher in London who was developing a high-end coffee table book series on North American landscape photography. They responded. They wanted the full series. The negotiation took 4 months and involved a Toronto-based arts lawyer I hired for exactly this purpose, which was the only time in my life I was grateful my father had made sure I grew up understanding how legal agreements work. The licensing deal closed for $280,000. The gallery show, which I had not expected to sell from, sold 41 prints in 6 weeks. 2 went to a collector in Vancouver. 1 went to the permanent collection of a gallery in Ottawa. The sales from the show came to just over $190,000 after commission. I sat in my apartment the evening after the gallery called me with the final figures. I had a glass of Niagara Riesling I had bought from the LCBO on the way home. I did the math on a notepad. Before taxes, I had cleared somewhere just under $500,000 in less than 8 months from one project. After the licensing agreement, 3 new commercial contracts that had come in on the strength of the distillery show, and several print sales through my website that had followed the press coverage, I was, by the following spring, in a financial position I had not imagined 2 years earlier. I paid my taxes fully and on time, as anyone with a competent accountant and a clear conscience should. I also set up a proper business structure with the help of that same arts lawyer. I kept living in my Dundas East apartment for another 4 months because it had that north-facing window I loved, and because there was no urgency, and I had learned to be suspicious of decisions made quickly. When I did eventually buy a property, it was in Prince Edward County, not a mansion, a restored 19th-century farmhouse on 12 acres outside Picton, with a barn I converted into a proper studio, a wood stove in the main room, and a view of the lake through the kitchen window that changed color 16 times a day, depending on the weather. I paid $1.4 million for it, which in Prince Edward County at that time was a significant but not extraordinary purchase. And I had the money and I wanted it, and it was the right choice. I kept my Toronto apartment for another year for the commercial work and then let it go. I was happy in a way I had not known how to be when I was living inside someone else's plan for my life. My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon in November. I was in the Picton farmhouse. There was ice forming at the edges of the lake. She used my full name when I picked up, Claire Elizabeth, the way she always did when she was nervous. She said she had been thinking about me. She asked how I was. I told her I was well. She said she had seen something about a photography show. She wasn't sure where. Perhaps a friend had mentioned it. I waited. She said she thought the work sounded beautiful. I said thank you. There was a long pause, the kind my mother specialized in, dense with everything she could not bring herself to say directly. She told me she missed me. I told her I missed her too. And I meant it, because I did. Because missing someone and being unable to live inside their idea of you can exist simultaneously without contradiction. She did not apologize. I had stopped waiting for an apology. Not because I thought one wasn't owed, but because I had come to understand that some people are constitutionally unable to apologize for the things they have done while believing they acted from love. My mother believed she had loved me correctly. The fact that she had stood in the hallway and said nothing while my father told me to leave. The fact that she had chosen the known geometry of her marriage over her daughter standing in the foyer with a camera bag. That was not something she would ever be able to name as a wrong she had committed. It was something I had decided to carry with a certain lightness. Not because it didn't matter, but because it would have been heavier to wait for her to lift it for me. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest conversation we had managed in 3 years. When we hung up, I poured a second glass of wine and watched the last of the light go off the lake. 3 weeks after that call from my mother, my brother reached out again. This time he texted first, which was unusual, asking if we could speak. When I called him back, there was something different in his voice from the last time. Less scripted, more tired. He had been at the firm for 7 years. He told me, in the careful, measured way he had learned from our father, that things were complicated at home. Our father had made some investments in a private equity venture with a former client that had not performed. Not catastrophic, he said, but the word complications appeared several times in the conversation. He said they might need to sell the Lake Joseph cottage. He said Dad would never ask directly. I understood immediately why he was calling. I understood it before the sentence was finished. He was not calling because he had missed me. He was not calling to apologize for standing in the hallway with our mother. He was calling because he had been sent, or had sent himself as a representative of a family that had decided my financial success was now a resource available to them, the same way my legal education had once been a resource to be managed. I let him finish. He said something about how families should come together in difficult times. He said he knew things had been strained. He used the word strained for what I would have called something considerably more serious than that. Then I said no. I didn't say it harshly. I didn't feel the surge of vindication I might have expected to feel, or perhaps had secretly hoped I would feel for some time before this moment arrived. I felt something quieter, something closer to clarity than satisfaction. I told him that I cared about him and that I hoped things would resolve. I told him that our father was an accomplished lawyer who had been managing complex finances for 30 years and that I had complete confidence in his ability to handle a difficult investment period. I told him that I was not in a position to step in financially, which was true in the sense that I had decided it was true, and that I thought the most helpful thing I could do was trust that they were capable of working through it themselves. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. I don't think he fully did. But the conversation ended, and it ended without bitterness, which felt like the only kind of ending that left anything intact. My father never called. I had not expected him to. Some people would rather sustain a loss quietly than acknowledge the terms under which that loss became possible. Jess came up to Prince Edward County the following spring for a shoot we were doing together, a collaboration for a magazine feature on regional food producers in Eastern Ontario. She stayed for a long weekend. On the last evening, we sat on the porch with the remnants of a meal I had cooked and a bottle of wine between us, and she asked me, not cruelly but genuinely, whether I ever thought about how different things would be if I'd gone to Osgood. I thought about it the way you think about a road you can still see from where you're standing, not with longing, more with a kind of spatial awareness of the distance you've covered. I would have become a lawyer. I would have become a lawyer. I would have been good at it, probably. I would have had my father's approval and my mother's relief and my brother's company at the firm Christmas party every year in the private room at a restaurant in the financial district. I would have had all the markers of a life correctly arranged, and I would have been standing inside it the way you stand inside a very well-built room that belongs to someone else. No, I told Jess, not really. The lake at dusk in Prince Edward County is a specific shade of rose gray that I have tried to photograph 100 times and have never fully captured. Not because I lack the skill, but because some things hold something in them that a camera can get close to, but never quite contain. I have made peace with that. I think the most honest work I do acknowledges exactly where the frame ends and what it leaves out, because leaving something out is also a choice, and every choice you make in a frame tells you something true about who you are. I kept building. I took on a residency at a gallery in Banff the following autumn. I spent 2 months in British Columbia shooting the coast and the interior for a project that would eventually become my second major series. I hired a studio manager in Toronto to handle the commercial inquiries that had kept growing since the distillery show, because the commercial work funded the personal work and I was no longer apologetic about the commerce of it. My father had taught me that much. Money is not neutral, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of dishonesty. My mother and I settled into something that I would describe as careful and genuine. We spoke on the phone every few weeks. She visited the farmhouse once in the summer and stood in the converted barn studio for a long time looking at the prints on the drying line without saying anything, and then she said quietly that she thought they were extraordinary. I believe she meant it. I also believed that she would go home and not tell my father she had come, and that this was, for her, a small private act of something that looked almost like courage. I accepted it for what it was. My brother and I found our way back to something easier eventually, on the other side of the conversation that had ended with my quiet no. He called the following Christmas. Not about money, just to talk. He sounded different, less like a representative of the family position and more like someone slightly exhausted by it. We talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with law or photography or our parents' expectations, about a road trip he wanted to take out west, about a book we had both apparently read in the same month without knowing it. It was the best conversation we had managed since childhood. We agreed to have dinner in Toronto in the new year. We did. My father and I have not spoken. There is a version of this story where that is the tragedy, and I understand why it might read that way from the outside. From where I'm standing, inside the life I built without his permission, it reads differently. Not as a tragedy exactly. More as a fact I have learned to hold with something other than grief. Some distances don't close because the person who could close them has decided that closing it would require an admission they are not willing to make. I stopped waiting for that admission a long time ago, and the day I stopped waiting was one of the quieter liberations of my adult life. There's a photograph I took in the winter of my first year in Picton. A bare sugar maple in a field about 2 kilometers from the farmhouse, shot at first light with the sky still the dark blue it goes in the minutes before the sun actually clears the horizon. The tree is entirely alone in the frame. The field behind it goes back to a tree line, and the tree line holds the sky, and the sky holds everything. The tree has no shelter and no company, and every branch is entirely visible, nothing hidden. I have it on the wall above my desk. Not because it's the best photograph I've ever taken, but because it was the first photograph I took after I stopped photographing for an audience of one. I look at it sometimes when I'm working, and I think about the specific quality of that early light, cold and completely honest, and how certain things only become visible when you stop trying to be seen by the wrong person. I am still becoming, I think. Most people are, if they're paying attention, but I am becoming in a direction I chose, in a place I built, with work that is mine in the way that work can only be yours when no one required it of you. That feels like enough. Some days it feels like everything. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that kitchen on a Tuesday morning in September, and the more clearly I see it, the more I understand that nothing about it was sudden. Everything that led to that door closing behind me had been accumulating for years, quietly and without announcement, the way water works its way into the foundation of a house long before anyone notices the crack. My father was not a cruel man. I want to be precise about that, because the easier version of this story would cast him as a villain, and that version would be dishonest. He was a man who had worked with extraordinary discipline to build something, and who had made the mistake that disciplined people sometimes make, which is to assume that the path that worked for them is the only path worth taking. He could not separate his love for me from his plan for me. In his mind, those two things were the same. That confusion cost us both something real. What I learned from that, slowly and imperfectly, is that integrity means knowing the difference between what you owe the people who raised you and what you owe yourself. You can be grateful for everything a parent provided and still refuse to trade your life for their approval. Those two things are not in conflict. Pretending they are is how people end up in careers they resent, living out decades of someone else's ambition while their own goes quietly dark. The 4 years I spent building the permanent things in near total obscurity taught me something I could not have learned any other way. I learned that the quality of your attention shapes the quality of your work, and that sustained, serious attention requires a kind of courage that has nothing dramatic about it. It is not the courage of a single decisive moment. It is the quieter courage of returning to something difficult every single day, without any guarantee that it will amount to anything. I drove back to the same 47 locations across 4 seasons, not because I knew what I would find, but because I believed the looking itself was worth doing. That belief had to come entirely from inside me, because there was no one standing behind me telling me it mattered. That is what I would want anyone to take from this, if they are in the middle of something their family cannot see the value of, or something the world has not yet recognized, or something they themselves are not sure about yet. The discipline of showing up to your own work before anyone has confirmed its worth is one of the most important things a person can build in themselves. It is not glamorous. It is not fast. But it is the thing that distinguishes people who eventually make something real from people who spend their lives waiting for permission that never comes. Claire did not get lucky. She got honest, first with herself about what she actually wanted, and then patient enough to build it properly without shortcuts. The consequences that followed, the sales, the farmhouse, the life that finally fit, those were not accidents. They were the natural result of years of clear-eyed effort. Cause and effect, nothing more mystical than that. And if there is any version of wisdom I have found worth keeping, it is simply this. The life you refuse to compromise on is the only one you will ever truly inhabit.